Hi there, everybody. Welcome to another issue, adventurous episode of Cocktails with Cruising World. Just lost my little mute button there for a minute, but I think we've recovered nicely. We're here today with Carolyn and Fatty Goodlander, a real treat, longtime friends of Cruising World, and they're on their boat Ganesh in Singapore, and we'll chat with them in just a minute. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping issues. At the bottom of your screen, there's a little Q&A. And if you have a question you want to ask, feel free to type it in, and Herb will be keeping an eye on them. And we'll jump in and relay your questions on to Carolyn and Fatty. Can't do a broadcast without thanking this week's sponsor. We have Mount Gay Rum. Happen to have a nice bottle of Eclipse here. Herb has got his vintage cask blend. Tasty rum. Sailors around the world love it. Mix mine with a little orange juice and a little lemonade. Mighty tasty. So with that, Carolyn, Fatty, welcome.
Hey, good to see you guys.
You guys are in a very different place on the planet than most of us. So what's going on in Singapore these days?
Well, Singapore is an incredibly remarkable place to be right now. You know, in many senses, if you watch the international news on the pandemic, you'll hear that New Zealand and Singapore are two exemplary places. Right now, we only have one person in ICU, and it's quite a success story here, how they've managed this crisis. And we've spent the 6 months in New Zealand, and then we travel through Indonesia here to Singapore. And Singapore offers an extremely high quality of life. Most people can't live here because it's so expensive. It's rated as the most expensive place in the world to live. And yet we live here with a far bigger swimming pool than the Prime Minister, lots more real estate, and we live here for $250 a day.
No, a month.
A month, sorry. A month. See, this is why she's the accountant. Notice that? Notice I get those small details incorrectly. But I think the amazing thing about Singapore is not that not that it's just such a incredibly dynamic place, but it's a place of kindness. And people constantly shock us by their kindness. People are always helping us out, and not just because we're visitors, but they're helping each other out. And constantly.
Yeah, people will come out of the store. If you'd asked for directions somewhere, they'll go outside the store and bring you, down the street to where you need to go.
And so we're constantly dealing with people who, when they see an older person, they really honor their elderly. They call us uncle and auntie. They constantly are helping. So when you see a person struggling for the door, I hop up trying to, beat the crowd to help. And it's so wonderful to be in a place that is like that, that challenges you. Now, I've been in places that make you harder, that you have to, kind of insulate yourself from something. And here it's the exact opposite. Everybody on the subway is trying to say, no, you go first. No, you go first. So it's really unique. We love Singapore very much. And
it's the safest place we've ever lived. You can walk anywhere, any time of day, at night, 2 o'clock in the morning. You can walk through the park. There's kids camping out in the park.
And if 3 or 4 girls want to go camping, they camp right in this urban park amid 6 million people. And there'll be 3 or 4 of them, and they'll have no chaperone. And if you say to their parents, "Are you sure that's okay?" They say to you, "What do you mean?" I mean, they don't know why. There was a guy came down to the Changi Sailing Club 3.5 months ago, and he dropped off an outboard. It's a brand new outboard, and it has the plastic on the case with the little sticker on the arm of the outboard. It's a 15 horse, and he dropped it off there. And I said, "Well, you want me to put it on my boat? I can give it to the owner when he comes." And he's like, "No, it'll be there." And the owner hasn't gotten around to picking it up in 3.5 months, and it's right on the sidewalk by the yacht club. I mean, it is just the most convenient possible outboard to take, and nobody takes it. The other thing is that the architecture here is can be very fragile. Banks can have varnished exteriors with beautiful carved wood and fragile things that you could just snap off, but if nobody snaps it off, so it's interesting. It's a completely unique place. And we are living here in a place for $250 a month where our daughter has to, pay $2,000 a month to park her car in her condo. So it's a strange juxtaposition. We've got some slides.
Oh, okay.
And we'd like to take a quick look at that if we can.
Oh, that'd be great. So it's safer feeling for a kid than Chicago was, huh?
It's a little different there. It's a little different. And we really feel kind of blessed to be here. Of course, our daughter is here. Our daughter, Roma Orion. And she has our two grandkids here. And so we spend virtually every weekend with them. And that's really good.
Are we ready?
Okay, we're ready.
Take it away.
Okay. Everywhere you go, there's these extravaganzas. We didn't even know what this was. I happened to be walking along with my Olympus. This is a lantern festival. This is on the waterfront, and there's constantly things for free. And they have lectures for free and educational classes for free and all sorts of artists and whatnot, and concerts. And so there's a tremendous amount of stuff to do for free. Singapore is a very wealthy country. It's got a huge savings, and it tries to spend that money on the people constantly. And so it's quite interesting. It's just a fascinating place to see. This is the downtown waterfront, and every evening they have the most incredible show where a light show, a laser show, where the whole harbor participates. All the boats come and see this thing, and this is basically a laser show that's projected on water. It draws anywhere from a couple of hundred to a couple of thousand people each evening. Fascinating show. And when you right across from that is what do they call this?
Gardens by the Bay.
Gardens by the Bay. And there's
part of it you have to pay, but part is free.
Free, and it's amazing. LSD here is illegal, but man, oh man, there's
another light show every night.
This is another light show. So and they're all within walking distance of each other. This is the lanterns that show is all about. And these lanterns, some of them are the size of small buildings, and they're illuminated, and they're all made by hand. And they're silk. Yeah. And it's just beautiful. And the culture here is absolutely fascinating. Here's a picture of the skyline. We cruise around Singapore all the time. It's a relatively small island that's fairly densely populated, and yet there's virtually no crime. In our neighborhood, our specific neighborhood, when we first came here 4 years ago, there was a bicycle that was stolen, and the police still have the sign of that bicycle. They're ever on the job. They're going to find out who took that bicycle. And here we are in our natural harbor here, Changi. And of course, my boat always has my name on it, and my outboard has its name. Here's our masts. And there's various boats. Of course, the Changi Sailing Club is unbelievably cool. It is like a Humphrey Bogart movie with Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall. It's very colonial looking. It's like very romantic.
It's from the 1800s.
It's from the 1800s, yeah. And there's people with silver trays bringing you drinks. And
but they say they have racing every weekend, every Friday, every Saturday, morning and afternoon. And
as a member of the club, we're allowed to use any of the 40 different vessels, from fleets of lasers and Optimus prams and whatnot. So it's really ideal for a sailor. This is our two women that greet us at the greeting desk, and they help us.
Yihan, the woman in the back is the sailing coach.
She's the sailing coach, and they one night at about 9 o'clock at night on a windy night, they heard somebody screaming, "Help! Help!" And since we were the only liveaboards in the harbor, they assumed it was us, and they went and got a boat and put an outboard engine on it and searched the river for hours and hours while we slept peaceably in our beds. But they're just incredibly cool. And the whole club here is, I can't just say enough, because they've never met a circumnavigator before, and they're pleased to have us. And they know that we showed up for all the free drinks. So they came to us and announced one day that there had been a change to the bylaws, and any free t-shirts, free drinks or free food that Ganesh, the crew of Ganesh, are automatically entitled to. So we don't have to ask or anything, just go in, you know. So, and I thought that was pretty cool that they read us that good. Carolyn, of course, strings pearls, Polynesian pearls around her mask. This is our friend Stanley. He is a great guy, and we met him here in Singapore in a movie theater. He bought us a cup of Starbucks coffee. He said it was the best investment he ever made. We've had him come out and visit us all over the world.
And we're teaching him to sail.
And we're teaching him how to sail and cruise, and he has spent months aboard the boat in various places.
He sailed with us from Grenada up to the Virgin Islands.
And here yesterday is a monkey. If you see the monkey on top of that forestay of that boat, the monkeys swim all around here, quite a few monkeys, and monitor lizards and crocodiles here.
Yeah, but that was pretty amazing. People were pretty upset about a monkey on their boat.
Well, monkeys can do a tremendous amount of damage, and
we think he just destroyed the wind indicator up there.
the wind speed, the anemometer, and many things happen in Singapore that wouldn't happen in a lot of places. Sophisticated kind of urban things, and this is the writing group that I'm involved with here in Singapore. And look at this group. I mean, to be with these people is such an honor. And a lot of them work for the, you know, the Straits Times, and some of them are fiction writers and they write novels, and others are poets and whatnot. But to have a long-term relationship as we come back, because we've come back here numerous times in various circumnavigations, and to see each other and to have these people as friends and co-workers is really, really, really wonderful.
Yep.
So we really feel honored to be here in Singapore, and we just can't say enough about the quality of life. Okay, are we back?
You're back.
Whoa, Carolyn, hooray! I got to say one thing. Yesterday, or last week, I had some deadlines for other publications. Now, guys, don't panic there, but I do work for other publications, and the outboard broke, and that was a big problem. And when the outboard broke, I didn't have time to fix it. Well, I had time to take it apart. We took it apart 3 times, Carolyn and I. But after the 3rd time, I couldn't get that engine to run, and I gave up. And on the 4th day, Carolyn took the engine to bits herself, and had vice grips and managed to get a few of the little jets out of the carburetor that I couldn't. Lo and behold, the outboard works. And then the next day, the solenoid to the propane stove stopped working. So she troubleshot that. I thought it might be a bad connection. And so she troubleshot that, and we replaced the solenoid, and thanks to Carolyn. So everything good is thanks to Carolyn, and all the problems on this boat are my fault.
Wisely said, Fatty.
Fatty, we're getting a lot of questions here, and I just wanted to tell our viewers that Fatty and Carolyn aren't actually seeing your questions. They're coming to me, and I will try to filter as many as we can along. It's great to see you guys. You look absolutely wonderful. It's I think the last time we got together in person was in Culebra a while back. But anyway, your writing group photo, and this goes along to a question, Fatty, that coming in from one of our viewers. And let me make it a 2-part question. I know you grew up on your sailboat. Grew up in a cruising sailing family. So you were a sailor right from the get-go. But when did you decide, or when did you just when did the notion of becoming a writer come to you? And that's the first part of the question. And what sort of advice would you have for folks who are sailing and would like to get into sort of blogging or writing articles for magazines or whatever, into sailing journalism? Tell us about your journey as a writer.
Okay, well, first of all, I encourage people to become writers. It's given me everything. So I am incredibly appreciative of the fact of incredible lifestyle that my pen has provided.
And didn't somebody say, if you want to be a writer, write? And,
you know, I mean, that's really what it boils down to. I was with my father, and we went into a convenience store sometime in the 50s. I was holding on to his thumb. I was very, very young. And as he was checking out of this convenience store, the Elizabeth was, you know, just down the road at some sort of a fishing dock. And the guy in the convenience store said to my father, he said, "Did you hear they just reached the summit?" And it was one of these mountain climbing. It was quite big in the 50s. And somebody had just reached some summit. And my father said, "Wow, did they?" Because they had lost a few men, you know. Yeah, and they were talking about this. And the guy said, "You know, climbing a mountain like that must be the hardest thing in the world to do." And my father smiled, and he had that smile that even as a young man, I knew was his smile, you know, his little smile. And he said, no, actually, writing a simple declarative sentence is the hardest thing in the world to do. So when I heard that, you know, I didn't know what a simple declarative sentence is. And as my editors, you may agree, but I have dedicated the rest of my life to trying to write that. I came down to the Elizabeth one day after school in St. Petersburg, Florida at Slip 7 of Vinoy Basin after attending the Mary A. White School there. And as I came up to the boat, I could hear crying. And I tiptoed on the boat and I went over and I looked down the center hatch. And my mother was working on her book and she had her face down on her manual typewriter and she was sobbing. And she had thrown all the manuscripts of her book onto the cabin sole of the Elizabeth. And I thought to myself, someday I'll cry like that too. So I thought I wanted to be a writer. I desperately wanted to be a writer. My sister Carol has written many books. My sister Gail writes grants. Writers were in me, but it was the thing I wanted to do most. But I'd only went to 3 years of grammar school and I'd only went to 2 years of high school. I didn't do too well in the high school thing except meeting Carolyn, who was our star valedictorian star student of the high school.
And he copied my homework.
And shh, don't tell him that. And when in the end, when the valedictorian ran away with the horrible dropout, it was a terrible thing for the education in America. So they told me that since I didn't know anything about grammar, there was something called grammar. I didn't know that there was, but there is evidently something called grammar.
And they know that you don't know that.
Well, I know that. I don't know that. So in trying to, you know, correspond with his editors, one of the editors asked me, you know, he said I had a dangling participle. Well, I checked my fly, you know, oh my God, is that dangling? I'm sorry. So I had some problems. So I decided not to become a writer. I decided to become a songwriter.
Like Bob Dylan.
Like Bob Dylan, but I didn't quite have the nose, you know, Bob Dylan's kind of got that beak, you know, and so I didn't have that. And Mick Jagger had those lips. I mean, those big Mick Jagger lips. But anyway, I started to try and write music, and I still play the guitar and I still write music. But Carolyn and I took a trip, a year's trip in South America on Carina, our boat. We were teenagers, and we took and drove up from Florida to New England in a car. And we had these people that we kept coming across doing kind of the identical thing, even though each one was completely different. But the first time was, let's say Georgetown, South Carolina. Our friend there, Ken Stolfa, invited us in. He couldn't believe that we were there. And he said, oh, this is so great to see you. He said, I've been following your adventures for a year. And we started talking, and it was obvious that—
But he followed your adventures because you had been writing to him in snail mail.
In snail mail, in letters, of course. And this was in the 70s. And so, you know, he was excited, and he reached underneath his seat, and he brought out a shoebox full of letters, and he had rubber bands on them, and he had memorized those letters. And I realized that he loved me more because of these letters. These letters had kept me alive and had kept his affection for Carolyn and I, you know, foremost in his mind. And you know, and I expected that. And you know, it takes a while to write a letter, and it was a good payoff for me. And I really appreciated the fact. But here was a guy who loved me, and he loved me more. And he said, Fatty, can you and Carolyn stay for dinner? And I said, sure. He said, well, could I invite a friend of mine? He'd love to meet you. And so he invited Bob. And Bob walked into the room of the thing, and he looked at me. Are you Fatty Goodlander? And I said, yeah. And he said, oh, that story when you're in Venezuela and you throw up on the nuns, that was the funniest story. And he starts reciting all the you know, crazy incidences in these letters. And it came to me, you know, like Shazam, you know,
maybe I can be a writer.
Maybe I can be a writer. This guy loves me. He's never met me. He loves me. If I can make people love me, I mean, if they'll pour their heart out to me, if they'll give me allegiance and affection, oh my God, you know. So I decided to ignore the fact that there were people that were constantly talking about my dangling participle. I mean, if they're having some sort of Freudian problems, it's not my problem.
Hey, Fatty,
Yeah.
Fatty, our boss, Sally Helm, says now you have to tell us the nun story.
I'll tell her that in private. Yeah, it's one of those stories, you know. It's one of those stories. But yeah, and the we, we have we have had so much fun doing this, and you know, the whole thing is. I think the secret to good writing, because we're talking about writing here, is to simply be yourself. And if you write enough, you have transparency of personality. I see everything in a humorous vein. So it all comes out funny. Early in my career, a publication called Modern Maturity asked me to do a story called The Last Rites, which was about, you know, what happens, you know, before you die and how you should prepare for it. And this was after Jessica Milford's The American Way of Death. And so I was intrigued, you know, wow, this is really cool. And I found out that on A1A in Florida, there's a drive-in movie theater. I'm sorry, a drive-in.
It was an old bank.
An old bank that was a funeral parlor. And you could drive off of A1A, you know, in a Camaro with the kids in the back, you know, when the window rolled down, rock and roll music and ganja smoke would be pouring out. And there behind the teller window was Uncle Harry, dead. And you could get the book, you know, and sign it. I thought this was fascinating. So I couldn't get an interview from any funeral director. So I got this, finally talked one into it. And it was a very dour. And I'm sitting in his living room of his funeral parlor, and the wife is there, and it's like an American Gothic. And he's saying, "What would you like to know?" And all of a sudden he has two phones there, and the green phone rings. And he says, "Excuse me, Mr. Goodlander, I'll have to take this now." And he grabs the green phone and he goes into the other room. And the minute he does that, his wife springs alive and says, "That's the death phone. We're at the beck and call of the dead. When we're making love, the dead stop us." Whoa. So I write this up for Modern Maturity. And, you know, oh my God. And they write me back the story and they say, "Fatty, that is the funniest story we have ever received at Modern Maturity. We have passed it around our entire staff. And if you think that we would possibly publish that." Anyway, I'm a humor writer. What can I say?
But they didn't publish it.
They didn't publish it.
They didn't pay you a kill fee.
They didn't pay me a kill fee. Okay. Crazy, huh?
Fatty, talk a little bit about, you've been 4 laps of the planet now. This one, as it turns out, is probably one of the stranger. But how has the cruising world changed since your first time around was when, in the early 80s?
Yes.
No, we went cruising basically up and down the East Coast in the 80s,
Yeah.
and through the Caribbean, down to Venezuela and back.
And we wanted to, we had a wonderful daughter named Roma Orion, and she enriched our lives, you know, fresh eyes. And we had a great time growing, you know, raising her aboard. I was raised aboard, and she was, you know, it was the only thing better than being a boat kid is to be a boat parent, you know. I think that the raising her has completely enriched our lives.
And in those days, there weren't many kids on boats. There were very few. Very few. Now there are a lot.
Yeah. And Roma knew every boat kid, every liveaboard kid, you know, in the Caribbean and the Atlantic, and who was in Nova Scotia, and who had just pulled into Venezuela, and who was at the Panama Canal, and who was in Tahiti. So it's pretty interesting. So we've seen a lot of changes. We have seen some distressing things, but we've also seen some things. And I think that this boils down to philosophy. One is, of course, we've seen some more pollution. We've seen more plastic in the water, and we've seen a lot less birds. It used to be where birds...
Not as much pollution as people, not as much plastic as people talk about. We've never seen giant rafts of plastic offshore.
Right.
Only along the shore.
Yeah, so we're, you know, these things change, but we don't... I agree with Carolyn, is that the dire things that, you know, sometimes we see reports on CNN, you know, about the plastic garbage in the middle, you know, we don't see that. And it's really wonderful to be able to say that, you know. So we've seen these changes, but there is magic. And there was magic for us when we went to sea. Carolyn and I, you know, first went to sea when we were 16, but she wouldn't leave Chicago at 16. She came down to sew my curtains. And she measured the curtains. They're simple rectangles, and she came down the next week and said, you know, I think I made a mistake. I have to measure the curtains again. I thought, boy, this is not a great seamstress. And then she came back the next weekend. Oh my God. She's been sewing happiness into my life ever since. So we really, you know, we have a wide view of all this stuff. The thing is that there is still the magic. There is still, you know, when you're receptive to it and you're fresh to it. And our job after—
But even in 1980, you know, we'd pull in somewhere and somebody would say, oh, you should have been here 10 years ago. You know,
yeah, they're always—
this is ruined now.
Right,
You know?
right. And they're always saying it's so expensive. Well, of course things are more expensive.
Yeah,
and,
then like we've been to Tahiti, you know, probably about 5-6 times, and you know, it's always fun, but it's not the same. But the person who's there the first time, they say, wow, this is incredible, this place, I've done this and this and this, and the Heva Festival is amazing, and you know, for them it's all fresh eyes, and it's new and it's wonderful, and
right.
every place is wonderful, you know.
Yeah. And you know, we really need to keep this fresh, and one of the ways that we keep it fresh is that if you think about visiting Tahiti, or spending, you know, as we have, years in French Polynesia, it might sound like, well, you know, you've seen one grass skirt, you've seen them all. But if you think of all these different destinations around the world as, you know, classrooms, as opportunities for education, now this suddenly changes everything, and there's so much to learn everywhere. Our philosophy is that everywhere we go, they have something to teach us. They have something to show us. They have something there. And we're not there to tell them how we do it in Boston or how we do it in Chicago. We're there to learn how they do it. We're there to question them. And if you're in a small island, the chief of that island, if he was in Detroit, he'd be running General Motors. You know, he might be running Google or Microsoft, but he's in this island, and, you know, he's risen to the top.
And he's got to keep everything going.
He's got to keep everything going. He's got a hard job.
And the water, clean water and garbage and sewerage, and keep everybody healthy. It's a big job.
Can you get the slides of the boat? So these type of changes are fascinating to us. The amount of differences here, but the important thing to realize is that the different areas are still incredibly vibrant. There's the magic is always there, and we feel that the magic is always there. Sorry. And going through some of these changes, do you think we have it? Oops. Okay, here we go, I think.
Do you see the?
I don't think it's big enough, hon. Maybe it needs to be started.
Okay.
Okay, here we go. Are we on?
Okay.
You're on.
Okay. Okay. This is a picture of Captain Fatty there. I'm the young one.
And your dad?
My dad. We're on a boat called the Friendship, and we're offshore heading to St. Joe. So, you know, there's been some changes. Of course, this boat has Egyptian cotton sails, tarred manila hemp anchor rode. Here I am on the Elizabeth. That is taken a few years later. And the Elizabeth, my father wanted to cruise around the world. He came back from World War II. He was quite disillusioned, and he wanted to buy an Alden boat. He had raced on them as a youngster, and he picked this boat and he saw it, and she was gorgeous boat when she was way out of his budget range. And but he kept looking at the Elizabeth, thinking that would be the ideal boat to have my family. And my father's dream of sailing wasn't to sail. He didn't want to just race. He'd done the Bermuda, he'd done the Mackinac, he'd done all kinds of racing, but he wanted to sail with his family. This concept of sailing and cruising and family are, you know, embedded in us. And he saw this boat, and it got hauled out to do a big refit, and it caught fire. So it was, you know, it burnt the deck area. And so it was an insurance deal. So they relaunched this half-burnt boat, and then it sank at the dock. So my father came down, squealing into the parking lot, looking at those lines leading down into the water, and said, $100. And he bought that boat for $100. Here's a picture of her. She's finishing the Bermuda race, coming in first in Class B. This is maybe 1932. Here she is, I forget which race this is, Chicago Yacht Club. She was owned by Lynn Williams. She's always kept the same name, Elizabeth. She's design number 213 in John G. Alden. Here is a boat called the Dorothea. This was in my family, well, it was way before I was born. And my father paid $10 for this boat, $5 for the actual boat, and $5 for the team of horses to drag it into his yard. If you look here, my father was a radio buff. And if you look at this radio right here by my cursor, you'll see that how big it is. That was the smallest kind of marine radio that you could possibly imagine. That's my mother. She was 19 there, and she wanted to travel. She just wanted out of Chicago. She wanted to travel. And here this man swept her off her feet with tales of sailing around the world and whatnot. That's my father. That's on this boat. He paid $5 for her, and we're still talking about her many years later. And my father, when he was holding me there, this is on the Elizabeth. I'm in the center there making that huge muscle. And this is the crew of the Elizabeth, my sister Carol, my sister Gail,
And their boyfriends.
and lots of boyfriends. And whenever my sisters left the boat, they had to have a chaperone. They couldn't leave the boat with any of their boyfriends or any of the sailors. We were anchored off of a naval base in Pensacola without a chaperone. And I not only was the chaperone, but I had a price. You know, every kid has a price. Well, I had a price. Actually, I had a price sheet. So depending on what was going on. There's my father holding on to the Elizabeth after she was burnt and sunk. Quite a large project. Here we are in 1957, cruising down the river. Now, the Mississippi River, we had to first go down it, and I didn't understand about temperature. I couldn't understand about how to get to the tropics. But when we went through our first lock and they pumped water in and out, I realized, aha, that makes sense. And then I thought to myself, they're pumping water in and out. When we get to the tropics, we'll go into a big cold room from Chicago, and then they'll pump all the cold air out, and they'll pump all the warm air in, and then they'll open the lock gates, and there'll be palm trees and whales. It's kind of like that. Here's my first command here in St. Petersburg, Florida. That's the Flagler Hotel in the background. The Flagler Hotel is right here. And the Elizabeth was tied up right there. And I petitioned the Optimist Club to allow me to compete before the age of 9. But they wouldn't do it. So I had to wait until 9. And at 10, I did win the St. Petersburg Optimist class champion, competing against all the other sailors, some of which were 16. But the funny thing was, across the bay, harbor here, this is one harbor, and across the harbor is the St. Petersburg Yacht Club, and that's where Kenny Reed and those guys were. And so when I say I won the St. Petersburg Opti Championship, some guys think I sailed against Kenny Reed. Well, Kenny Reed will tell you that that's not true.
Well, he's much younger than you two.
He is a little bit younger. Okay, now here's an amazing thing. We're putting up the rig on the Elizabeth right now. We have just completed the bowsprit. And if you notice, there's no forestay on the boat. We do have our twin bob stays and our whisker stays. But we took this picture thinking that we were just taking a picture. But if you look in the background, this is my childhood. The boat,
1958, probably.
yeah, maybe 58, 57. And this boat here, and this boat here, I mean, these are the boats that taught me how to splice. These are the crew members that taught me.
Those are working fishing boats.
Yeah. And it looks more like, I mean, if somebody showed me this picture, I'd say, oh, that's Nova Scotia in 1920. But that's in the 50s in Florida. And these are the people that I grew up with. And I never went to school. So when the truant officers would come, I would climb up, scurry up the rig. That was my standard thing. At 15, I was in a funeral parlor having a party. And a guy in that party was drunk, and he was talking about a boat he was going to chop up for coho fishing. And it was a poop box, although he didn't call it a poop box, but he just, with the S word, he said it was a crappy little boat, and that he had it and he was going to chop it up for coho fishing. I bought that boat at 15, and at 16, that's when I invited Carolyn down to sew my curtains. She's been sewing happiness into my life ever since. I tell people that I write small stories from small craft. And here I am with my typewriter in a boat that I made out of a single piece of plywood, 1 4x8 sheet of plywood. This is a boat. We had a cup of wind here in the BVIs. And
Was this Irma?
this was Irma, I guess. Anyway, people always ask me the difference between multi-hulls and monohulls. So it's interesting. And a lot of people, when I show them this picture, they perceive me as in front of a building or something. Anyway, it went carting through the BVI Soper's Hull. This is Karina, as I say, I bought this boat at 15. This is thousands of miles away from where we bought the boat in the Gulf of Mexico. And if you notice that she's slightly mistrimmed there, but by mistrimming the sails, I could get her to steer herself forever. I replaced 7 planks and 17 frames and everything you see above the deck. So that cabin and everything I did as a teenager when I was 17. So I rebuilt this boat extensively. We sailed it extensively, had a wonderful time.
You only paid $200 for it.
I only 200. That was a lot of money for a Goodlander. 200. My father only paid $100 and he got twice the boat. He would never let me forget that. He would say, $200? What are you, crazy? Okay, so at 19, Carolyn said to me, well, we need a bigger boat. And I was like, well, boats are hard to come by, honey, you know. And she said, well, what's the chances of buying a used boat? I said, well, nobody would lend us any money. And she said, well, why don't you build a boat? And I said, well, Carolyn, that's kind of complicated. And she said, well, I'm sure you could do it. And when she said that, I was just like, wow. So I went to, now at the time I was reading Slocum's Sailing Alone Around the World, and his boat read Boston on the transom. So I wanted, if I was going to build a boat, I damn sure wanted to say Boston on the transom, but I figured it would be kind of illegal if I built it somewhere else and put Boston on the transom. So I went to Boston, and I found out that I couldn't rent a small warehouse, but if I found a commune, if I made a commune, and then we rented a huge warehouse, that it was much easier to rent big things. I couldn't rent an apartment because I couldn't come up with the first and last security deposit. But I could rent an apartment building. I mean, it sounds crazy. But anyway, I rented this huge warehouse at 370th Street and started building this boat with Carolyn's help. And there is a picture of her. Her name is Carlotta. She's an Endurance 35 design. And we built her from scratch, every single thing. And to go from this as a teenager to that is something that's has stuck with me forever. And
It did take 7 years.
It took 3 years to launch, and you know it's hard to know when a boat is done. But we had the boat for 18 years, and I always have felt that if I, with Carolyn's help, I can do virtually anything. Here she is under sail, racing in various events. Here's a wild card. She was sunk and holed and smushed up on the side of the beach. This side, this port side was underwater, but the starboard side never went underwater. She was kind of awash on the beach with a 3-foot by 12-foot hole in her. Anyway, that's wild card. We paid $3,000 for her. We sailed her around the world twice. We owned her for 23 years, and that figures out to slightly less than 3 cents a mile. And here she is in Suakin. And Suakin, in Sudan. And notice that they don't maintain their buildings very well here. And this is one of the most fascinating places we have ever been. It's in the Red Sea. It is just absolutely amazing. And there was a guy, most of the people you can't take a picture of Suakin that doesn't look like it's out of the Bible. I mean, it is so, there's not a piece of glass, there's not a pavement or a brick or a window or
an electrical. We were there a month and saw one car.
We saw one car and it had said UN on the side. UN. And if you look at this Islamic church thing, the mosque, he would come up and he would sing out the window, no amplification, he'd just sing. Anyway, there was a guy in the town that we would see with a white shirt. He was somebody, and he met us and stopped us one day and he said, oh, you're tourists. And I said, yeah, I guess we are. And he said, everybody's scared to come here. And I said, well, our State Department said that, you know, we shouldn't come, that they would lop off our heads, you know. But he said, you know, we don't get many tourists. So we're trying to, you know, we like tourists and everything. He said, you know, just pay attention to the landmarks, you know. So we figured they were trying to develop their tourism. And he said, we have signs. So if you see the sign, make sure you pay attention to it. So, okay. So we're walking from town to town, and we normally walk down the road, but we decided to cut across the sand dunes. So we're cutting across the sand dunes here. And here comes this modern sign. I'm on the other side of it. Looks just like you'd have on any street corner.
Like a no parking sign.
Like a no parking sign. And so Carolyn's behind me, and I say, oh, there's one of the signs they were telling us to, maybe it's a historical site or something. So I looked at that site, and I said to Carolyn, I said, stop. And she said, what? And she kept walking. I said, stop. And she said, what's the matter? I said, land mines, not marks, land mines.
And there was a picture of a man with his leg getting blown off.
Oh my God. Oh, there's Lynn. Every time we go to New Zealand, we go to Thanksgiving with Lynn and Larry. Unfortunately, not Larry anymore, but Lynn. I wrote a book on heavy weather, and Carolyn says, she's just amazed that I write these books. She came to me on my book about anchoring. She said, tell me everything you know about anchoring. And I said, more scope. She said, that's it? More scope? I said, yeah, most people don't use enough scope. They should use 7-to-1 scope in any kind of a blow. She said, that's 2 words. She said, do you think you could make that $400, 400 pages? I said, well, if there's money in it, I could. Here's my daughter and the grandkids. We loved having them. Here we are in the Panama Canal. Just recently, our transit. Do I like solar cells? You answer me that question. Is that enough solar cells for you?
It runs the refrigerator, the water maker, all the lights.
Everything.
And computers.
And here we are in Tahiti. And if you spend a lot of time in the Caribbean, you'll notice that those island mountains are completely different than the island mountains in the Caribbean. They're jagged. That's because they're much younger. So the Caribbean looks rounded and Polynesia looks jagged. This is in Moorea. Here's our boat. We found this boat. They wanted $140,000 for it. I offered $40,000. They said, that's ridiculous. They started screaming at me. I got up from the table and I walked out into the parking lot, and they followed me out in the parking lot, screaming at me as I crossed the parking lot, and they're screaming at me as I got into the car, screaming at me. And I thought, I know what happens when I don't want a deal. I shut up. I say, no, thanks. And if they're still screaming at me, that's a good sign. I bought this boat for $56,000, and we've sailed it around the world 1.5 times now.
But we put a new engine in it and did a year's work, solid year's work.
What's a year's work between lovers? I mean, a year is nothing. And here we are in the sunset. So there's been quite a few changes in our lifestyle. And of course, doesn't matter, you can do anything you want there. So we've really seen some changes both in terms of our life, and we think that our current boat, what did I do? You might have shut off, I don't know. Okay, we're gonna let her take care of that.
Are you still?
We've seen quite a big change in our life. Let me help you here. And, okay. Are we back?
There you are.
Okay, great. I hope some of that made sense, and I hope those pictures came through. We went through some changes, and this boat is so plush for us compared to the Carina, which was 22 feet long, that when we first got it, we had our handheld VHFs, and Carolyn would be in her head, and I would be aft in my head, and we would be saying, "I'll meet you Wednesday in the main cabin."
Hey, Fatty, we're quickly running out of time here.
Okay, all right.
But before we do, one of the people online watching all of this is your sister. Can we bring her in and do a little fact checking here?
Yes, we would love that.
Gail, are you there?
I am here. Can you hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Perfectly.
Can you see me?
We can't see you.
See if you can work on your video. But you do sound great.
Let me see. Where is my video? Oh dear.
Says it's recording.
Oh dear.
Maybe the bottom left of your screen.
Yeah, that's where
Yeah, I see the
Press the arrow.
I don't see the video. Oh heck.
Oh heck. Now I'm going to tell you about Gail. Gail taught me to read. As I said, I didn't go to school, but Gail and my sister Carol taught me to read. And as I said, I was their chaperone. So we had so much fun together. we have been very, very close. And all Goodlanders in times of stress build vessels. So Carol was involved in Ruby B and Mano, and Gail was involved in the Ark. And the picture of that warehouse that I showed you was behind me in that picture was her husband's and my, her husband Momo and Gail's boat. So we've had this long history of boat building, and it's true that every time something happens and Goodlanders kind of panic, you know, we quick, oh my God, you know, we have to build a boat and whatnot. And I owe a tremendous debt to Gail of not only being, you know, supporting me my whole life in terms of, you know, in so many different ways, but for teaching me to read and instilling that thing. And I used to have a book talking about, you know, is it a pig? Does it say oink? And if it wasn't for those days of her instilling this incredible lust for reading, I wouldn't be a writer and I wouldn't be able to do all this stuff. And Gail is absolutely superb. She has all kinds of degrees and
Gail's
stuff.
actually teaching memoir writing.
She's teaching stuff, and she's a good artist too. Her husband's a fine artist, and she can do anything except operate Zoom.
That's for sure.
So Gail, Herb and I have a question for you. We've both been editing Fatty for quite a few years now. Is there any truth to any of this?
Not much. But occasionally he does kind of skirt around the truth, and then he makes up no, he's always tells the truth.
Hey, that's it.
Yeah, always tells the truth.
Fatty, we're getting close to the end here. I know you had a little something you wanted to show us.
Pardon?
What's that?
The video.
Oh, a video. Oh yeah,
Little
we're gonna
video.
try and run this video. And we think we can do it. And it was wonderful talking to you, Gail. Let's Zoom together soon.
Okay, and I'll have it really work this time.
Okay, that is absolutely great. Okay, you get the sharing thing ready, I think. We're gonna try and share.
Not this great either. Why is it not? Oh, here. How do you start it?
Okay, I assume that we're going here. Do you see some picture?
We do.
Okay, here we are. And this is the Elizabeth. If you notice, there's straps on the Elizabeth. And the straps are because we've just launched her. She's in Rentner's Boatyard.
And who's dancing?
And there is Rentner's Boatyard. See the sign? And the Elizabeth's transom there. This is in, I don't know, Gail would know better than I of what year it was, maybe 55 or something. And when I sail, I'm constantly doing a little dance. I just love sailing, and I've always loved everything about boats. And here we are launching it. And boy, oh boy, I love to dance. And here we go with my little dance as we launch the Elizabeth. Isn't that the silliest thing? And that's Gail right there. That's Gail's head
And your mom.
and my mom. And it was a wonderful day. Okay, let's stop. Very good. So I've certainly enjoyed this, and I'm so glad, Gail. What year was that, Gail?
That was 55, I think.
55. Now, what age were you at that time?
Let's see, I've always been about 23, 24. Oh, at that time you're talking about. I was 12 in October when we left, 1957, when we left on the boat.
1957 we left. And what, how many years were we in the shipyard? I don't really remember. I just remember being there a long time. For years, 3 years?
In Rentners?
Yeah.
You were 2. And we
I was
left
2.
1954 to 1957, mostly on dry dock, mostly fixing up. We were only about 6 months in the water waiting to go.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks so much for joining us, Gail. This was unexpected, and I can't wait till we'll do this again with you in Zoom. That's really fun.
I know, no picture. I washed my hair for nothing.
Oh my God.
Oh,
That's
my
incredible. If I'd have known that, we would have sent a technician. I wash my hair too, Gail.
I saw that. I love you, Fatty.
I love you, Gail.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
So Mark,
Okay, well, I think it's come time to, unfortunately, it's come time to wrap things up. just to remind everybody, this is a series, so we'll be back next Wednesday night with Andreas Hyde. He's the from the sailing vessel Barbara. He's kind of a bit of a madman. He sails, as you know, 37 from southern Norway up to above the Arctic Circle and spends the winter swimming with the orcas. So he's got some amazing footage of the whales and the sailing, and I think it'll be a fairly entertaining time. Any thoughts there, Herb?
Oh, it's great to see you, Fatty, Carolyn. It's great to see you guys. Be well. You look happy and healthy, and keep doing what you do.
Okay, well, we are
Thank
happy, and
you.
we are amazing thing really in my fact, you know, people ask me, what should you do if you want to circumnavigate? What should you do if you want to be, I'm on my 60th year of living aboard. What's the first thing you should do? And there's no question of what that is, and that's marry Carolyn.
And Carolyn, you get the last word for a change.
Oh, I don't know what the last word should be, but we wish everyone great sailing and just go for it. Just as long as it's fun, and keep going till you don't want to do it anymore. Do something, but always have your dreams. Follow your dreams.
And we think that you know, people are their dreams.
See, I don't get the last word.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry. The story of our life.
Thanks, you guys, very much.
Thank you.
See everybody next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So we can leave, I think. Yoo-hoo! Coffee.